that all Apollo and Gemini flights were accompanied, both from a distance and sometimes quite close, by spacecraft of extraterrestrial origin, such as flying saucers or UFOs. Aldrin and Armstrong are said to have been condemned to silence after the moon mission, and on the moon. One of the lunar mysteries began with a signal. At first, it was just a faint chemical trace, then another and another. Ultimately, the signal was found in different missions and with different measurement methods, and all of them pointed to the surprising fact that there is something on the moon that shouldn't actually be there. To understand what this means, we have to turn back the wheel of time to 1976 and take a look at the Soviet Union's last major lunar mission. In and of itself, however, Luna 24 did not make any exciting headlines at the time. The probe did not celebrate any resounding triumphs or set any new records. And yet, it did something that was much more significant than anyone initially suspected. Specifically, it drilled almost 2 meters deep into the lunar soil, extracted a thin column of dust and rock, and brought it back to Earth. All in all, the sample weighed only about 170 grams, but the secret it held was a real heavyweight. Among all the gray regolith slumbered something that no scientist would ever have thought possible: traces of water. At around 0.1%, these traces were tiny, but still big enough to shake our image of the moon. Well, at least that's what you might think. But if you believe that this discovery immediately triggered a scientific earthquake, you're mistaken. In fact, what should have been a real sensation was dismissed as mere contamination. The researchers were certain that the water must have come from Earth and had been mixed into the sample either by the lander itself or later in the laboratory. After all, there was no doubt that the moon was a bone-dry celestial body. That's what it said in the textbooks, and everyone knew it. Surprisingly, this was not the first time something like this had happened. During the Apollo missions, samples had contained very similar traces, but in this case too, the minimal residues of hydrogen-containing compounds, such as hydroxyl, were dismissed as insignificant interference signals. And so it came to pass that this data was archived for decades, but never seriously pursued. No one planned to go to the moon to search specifically for water, and the basic assumption that it simply did not exist there remained. This only changed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the findings were no longer considered contaminants, but finally overlooked evidence. And when the scientific community was finally ready to see the true face of the moon, our constant companion itself began to reveal new clues. The mystery of the shadow craters. Standing at the edge of certain craters near the lunar poles, you see something that seems almost supernatural. And that's not because of what you see, it's because of what you don't see. Quite simply, there is no light here. Instead, there is only a stoic shadow that has not moved for billions of years. Appropriately, these zones are called permanently shadowed regions, or PSRs for short, and they exist because the moon's axis of rotation is tilted by only about 1.5 degrees. When the sun shines over the moon's poles, its light grazes the surface almost horizontally, which, conversely, means that there are places that are plunged into eternal darkness. Temperatures of minus 248 degrees Celsius have been measured in some of these shadow craters. Not only is this colder than the surface of Pluto, it also transforms the PSRs into a natural freezer that permanently preserves the substances contained there. And that harbors enormous potential. If water has ever been deposited here, it could still be slumbering in these lunar cold traps. Specifically, it may have been brought to the moon by water-rich comets or asteroids, and those responsible wanted to get to the bottom of this exciting theory. In 1998, Lunar Prospector finally made the long-awaited breakthrough. The probe discovered a high concentration of hydrogen at both poles, especially in regions that are permanently in shadow. On the one hand, this meant that between 10 and 300 million tons of water ice could be distributed at the moon's poles. And on the other hand, it was an absolute game-changer for future lunar research. However, there was still one crucial catch. Hydrogen alone does not prove the existence of water. Water could also occur as hydroxyl or be bound in minerals. The instruments on Lunar Prospector and other orbiters were unable to tell the difference, and for the researchers, this was frustrating, to say the least. They had strong indications of the presence of water, but no certainty. To change this, those responsible came to a radical conclusion. True to the motto, if we can't get to the shadow ice, it must come to us, it was decided in 1999 to crash Lunar Prospector into one of the craters near the South Pole. In the best-case scenario, the impact would send the debris cloud so high into space that Earth-based telescopes could analyze it and search for any traces of water ice. But the brutal experiment failed, and no water could be detected. It is unclear whether this was due to an unfavorable impact angle or the measuring instruments. But what is certain is that the Japanese space probe Kaguya attempted something very similar almost a decade later. But this time, too, the hoped-for direct hit failed to materialize. But then came L-Cross. In 2009, the probe raced into the Cabeus crater at the South Pole together with the empty upper stage of its rocket. The upper stage hit first, followed minutes later by L-Cross itself, which flew through the column of debris that had been thrown up. And this time it worked. Water vapor and other volatile substances were detected directly for the first time. Finally, science had concrete evidence of ice on the moon, and yet some questions remained unanswered. Chief among these was how much ice our satellite really hides. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and India's Chandrayaan-1 made an unexpected discovery in this regard. Unexpectedly, they identified evidence of hydroxyl and water molecules directly on the sunlit surface. Suddenly, it was clear that lunar ice is not only found in perpetual shadow, but across the entire celestial body. The old ideas about the dry moon were finally outdated, and our companion turned out to be much more complex and mysterious than anyone had ever thought possible. The sweating moon. Even more surprising, however, was how the signal changed over the course of the lunar day. During lunar noon, when the sun was hottest, the water signals weakened or even disappeared completely. But as temperatures dropped in the evening, they reappeared, almost as if the moon were sweating. However, the molecules did not return in the form of puddles or frost, but as isolated particles that adhered to the surface or wandered through the thin exosphere, and no one had expected that. After all, the moon has no real atmosphere, no atmospheric pressure, and no weather. And yet the data pointed to a water cycle at the molecular level, controlled solely by heating and cooling. However, the origin of the water has not been conclusively clarified. Micrometeorites could bring tiny amounts to the moon or release it from minerals. Alternatively, solar wind could also produce hydroxyl, which converts to water over time. In 2023, India finally sent Chandrayaan-3 to the moon to search for water at the lunar South Pole. The Pragyan rover landed on the surface as planned, but confusingly, there was no trace of water. The samples examined contained aluminum, iron, calcium, chromium, sulfur, and titanium, but neither water nor hydroxyl. And this despite the fact that Pragyan was deliberately placed in the most promising region. Despite all this, Chandrayaan-3 provided valuable data. Measurements showed that the uppermost layers of the regolith heat up significantly, while temperatures drop sharply just a few centimeters below. The lunar soil is an excellent insulator. The heat stays at the top, while it remains cold enough underneath to preserve water. This could also explain why the rover did not detect any water, even though orbiters registered traces of hydrogen. The ice could be hidden just below the surface, slumbering under an insulating layer of dust. However, the search for water on the moon is no longer purely for research purposes. Water also represents a potentially useful resource for future missions and permanent bases. In addition, it also has geopolitical and economic advantages. Whoever controls the water also has a significant influence on the future of space travel. But the reality remains contradictory. We have strong hydrogen signals from orbit, but no findings from landing vehicles. Water vapor has been detected in impact clouds, but no visible ice. And even in craters that are permanently in shadow, there has been no clear confirmation of ice to date. Possible explanations for why we have not yet found water directly are that it is too thinly distributed, too deep below the surface, or chemically bound. Our current detection methods are simply not yet sufficient. Orbiters cannot dig, landers cannot go deep enough, and spectrometers only provide indirect evidence. Despite all these obstacles, interest in lunar water is not waning. And one thing is certain, the secrets of the moon will not remain hidden from us forever. If we do indeed find usable water there, it will open the door to a new era of space travel, and with it, the possibility of a permanent presence on a celestial body other than Earth. What did Chang'e 5 discover on the moon? The Chang'e 5 mission landed on the moon on December 1st, 2020, after a 23-day journey through space. The dual probe had been launched from the Wenchang spacecraft launch site of Hainan province of China. This is the same site from where predecessor probes Chang'e 3, numerous satellites, as well as the components and supply flights for the Chinese space station have been launched. After successfully separating from the orbiter, Chang'e 5's lander touched down in a lunar area that scientists called Oceanus Procellarum. This region near the lunar equator is a vast, flat area on the far side of the moon, characterized by its extreme breadth and the proximity of the 5,250-foot-high Mons Rumker. The objective of the Chang'e 5 mission was very clearly defined. The nearly 8-ton probe was to collect samples from the lunar surface and bring lunar rock back to Earth for the first time in 40 years. For the very first time in human history, this mission was to extract samples from the deep layers of the moon. In recent years, scientists had come to realize that the moon might be very different from what we had long thought. It could even be possible that the moon harbors a large reservoir of mineral resources that could solve our energy problem. After successful drilling, the lander sent the samples back to its orbiter via the Ascent module, and the return journey to Earth began after only 14 Earth days. The mission was celebrated worldwide as a great achievement of Chinese space travel, clearly elevating China into the ranks of the great spacefaring nations of this Earth. The return of the samples was eagerly anticipated by international researchers. We can already reveal this much: the hopes for new groundbreaking insights about the moon were more than fulfilled. Water in glass? On December 17th, 2020, the return capsule entered Earth's atmosphere and landed successfully in the sparsely populated expanse of Mongolia. As soon as the samples were secured, the experts got to work. With great anticipation, it was expected whether the drillings would confirm the existing theories about the moon's creation, or if the moon's interior would reveal an entirely different truth. Scientists believe that a planet the size of Mars collided with the Earth more than 4 billion years ago, creating the moon. During the collision, a part of the Earth broke off and was covered with molten rock. Until now, it was assumed that the temperatures were so high that all the water evaporated forever. The moon was considered a parched celestial body that was slowly shrinking, or, in other words, drying out. In the recent months and years, telescopes and probes have found large deposits of water ice in craters near the lunar poles. The narrative shifted, and everyone started questioning where the ice on the moon came from and why it had never been noticed in more than 50 years of intense lunar exploration. NASA plans to send astronauts near the poles as part of the Artemis mission in the coming 10 years. Once there, the astronauts are to determine whether the water deposits on the moon can be utilized. In a planned permanent station on the moon, the water could provide for humans, grow plants, and also be used to produce fuel. Now, the discovery of Chang'e 5 could completely overthrow all these plans, as this rover has discovered the seemingly impossible on the small, inconspicuous celestial body. Large quantities of water, and that's everywhere on the moon. In the drill samples, researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences found an unusually high density of tiny glass particles. These tiny glass crystals have most likely formed when meteorites struck the moon. Hitching a ride on the comet could also have brought water to the moon, which is now frozen at the poles. Upon closer examination, the impact glass beads revealed another secret that simply left researchers speechless, because inside the beads they found water. Each particle only contains a tiny portion of water, but in bulk, the water deposits on the moon are enormous. Can you imagine that? Large amounts of water on the moon? That also sounded unusual to us, but the Chinese study leaves no doubt. In each individual crystal, there are 2,000 parts water to 1 million parts. So, as you can see, it's really small, and the beads are not even a millimeter in size. But the bulk is made up of water, and now brace yourselves, because when the concentration is converted to the entire moon, there are 2,000 kilograms of water in every metric ton of lunar soil. Under Earth conditions and in liquid state, this is pretty much equivalent to 2,000 liters, which is a whole lot. The likelihood that these glass particles are even distributed across the entire moon is high. After all, the entire moon has been bombarded by comets, asteroids, and meteorites for billions of years. This implies that the moon could be abundant in water from the equator to the poles. Future manned moon missions, therefore, wouldn't necessarily have to land at the poles and then laboriously attempt to utilize the water ice there. The water from these beads can be easily isolated through heating, thus providing moon settlers with fresh water anywhere on the celestial body. In further investigations, Chinese researchers were even able to demonstrate that the water enclosed within the lunar crystals was once produced by the sun. The theory suggests that positively charged hydrogen atoms from the solar wind made their way into the glass beads and mixed with the oxygen contained within them. Studies of the different types of hydrogen atoms in the samples have shown that these glass beads can also release part of their hydrogen charge at high temperatures when they are heated by solar radiation. The total amount of water wealth in the form of impact glass beads is estimated to be around 298.7 billion short tons, according to current estimates. In 2010, NASA estimated the water quota at the moon's North Pole to be 661.4 million short tons. Compared to previous assumptions that the moon was bone dry, this is truly enormous. Even compared to our Earth, the abundance of water is impressive. Our blue home of water and rock is estimated to hold approximately 1.47 quintillion short tons of water. Now you're probably wondering if there could ever be a time when this moon ice melts, or if the moon could be transformed into a landscape with rivers, lakes, or entire oceans through a chemical or mechanical change in the water glass beads. Of course, we also asked ourselves this question and investigated the matter. Although such ideas would be fantastic, it will unfortunately hardly be possible to let water flow on the moon's surface. The moon has virtually no atmosphere, extreme temperatures, and only very low atmospheric pressure. Water can only liquefy under certain conditions, and these simply aren't present on the moon. Since the moon does not have a particularly high density and has only a very weak magnetic field, it's also not expected that changes will occur here in the future. However, it's a completely different story with Mars, where liquid water once flowed. Traces of erosion have confirmed this multiple times, and audacious plans for terraforming aim to transform particularly the frozen Mars water at the poles into liquid water and thus into seas and lakes through an artificially induced greenhouse effect. However, experts also doubt here whether this would ever be realistically achievable. But let's go back to the moon and the fascinating findings of the Chinese astronauts. The glass beads revealed other things besides just water. The latest exciting discovery could soon trigger a real rush to the moon. Could our energy problems be solved with this? The samples collected by the Chinese space probe are unique. Taken from deep layers, they are about 1 billion years older than all the samples collected from the surface by astronauts during the American Apollo program. Most likely, these glass beads have been formed predominantly over the last 2 billion years through massive meteorite, asteroid, and comet impacts. To generate the necessary temperatures, impact dimensions are needed that are roughly comparable to the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs on Earth about 68 million years ago. As a relatively small celestial body, the moon has been exposed to massive cosmic influences throughout its developmental history, and it's a wonder that the moon has survived these bombardments so well. Researchers believe that this is due, among other things, to its low density and the thick cushioning layer of dust. The moon's turbulent life could have produced a whole range of peculiarities from which we may benefit enormously in the future. Chang'e 5 found another crystal in the lunar rock, and it could be significant because this moon crystal is made of a substance that was previously completely unknown. Researchers were amazed and dumbfounded at the same time when they noticed that this structure has a crucial component for nuclear fusion. For those not quite familiar with nuclear power, it's worth mentioning at this point that Earth's energy problem would be solved as soon as we have the possibilities for nuclear fusion. So far, we have used the principle of nuclear fission to meet our enormous energy hunger. However, resulting radioactive waste has become a massive problem. In nuclear fusion, light atomic nuclei are fused into heavier nuclei. This releases a far larger amount of energy than nuclear fission, and the residues are radiation-free. For decades, physicists worldwide have been working on this technology, but so far without success, because the pressure and therefore the energy input necessary to make the nuclei fuse exceeds the energy gain. The problem would be solved instantly if we could find a mineral or an atom that inherently has an increased readiness for fusion. And that is exactly what has just happened. The isolated phosphate mineral was named Chang'e Y in honor of the mission and the Chinese moon goddess Chang'e. Future research at the Beijing Research Institution of Uranium Geology will show whether the fusion-ready helium-3 isotope will be usable on Earth. So, could it soon be that mining begins on the moon, spacecraft bring rock to Earth on a daily basis, and our planet can take a breather for the time being? Well, we don't know that yet. The Chang'e 6 mission is set to collect further samples from the far side of the moon starting in 2024 and bring them back to Earth. The developments are currently being watched closely, and of course, NASA has also taken notice. Experts have calculated that the entire US can be powered for a year with about 27.6 short tons of helium-3. This easily corresponds to the cargo volume of a space shuttle. Helium-3 from the moon is estimated to have an economic value of $3 billion per short ton. In fact, this discovery could trigger a gold rush and attract many nations and companies to the moon. Some major energy corporations have already shown interest to NASA in investing money in future space missions. This could mean that NASA's Artemis program gets a significant boost. Are you fed up with being lied to about what's really going on in space and on the moon? The NASA probe has discovered a bizarre, huge mass under the surface of the moon, and it should be clear by now, we are not alone in the universe. The ideas that there are moon people or a dark threat emanating from the moon are possibly as old as the moon itself. We have been sending probes to the moon for around 100 years, and humans have also been there and looked around. The second person to ever set foot on the moon was Buzz Aldrin. Together with his astronaut colleague, Neil Armstrong, Aldrin was on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 mission, and what he saw there is incredible. At the age of 84, Aldrin gave a thought-provoking television interview that caused quite a stir. For the first time, Aldrin spoke about an incident during the moon landing that he had not said a word about for more than 40 years. A quote from Aldrin: "Through the window, I saw a light that was apparently moving parallel to us." In the interview, Aldrin reported that during the entire landing approach in 1969, a green light flew parallel to the landing capsule in which Aldrin and Armstrong were located. Aldrin went on to say that this light had remained unidentified for all those years. The space veteran went on to say that there were explanations that did not point to a spaceship from other nations or other worlds. It could also have been a piece of the rocket stage, a shutter that reflected the sunlight. But anyone who correctly interpreted Aldrin's undertones in the interview immediately understood that this man himself did not believe in a natural explanation. For Aldrin, the light was something that followed them and watched the two astronauts as they flew to the moon. This was by no means the only sighting of aliens around the moon. Alan Bean saw a strange pillar of light during the Apollo 12 mission. In 1971, Apollo 15 astronaut James Irwin filmed an object that looked like a flying saucer hovering over the surface of the moon. NASA repeatedly claims that sightings like this are optical illusions. Light phenomena are dismissed as dust or camera reflections, but the community of those who have completely different explanations is already huge. Even if NASA astronauts are not allowed to talk, there are now dozens of whistleblowers and witnesses, even from within NASA, who report that aliens maintain secret bases on the moon. In the 1990s, the US psychic Ingo Swann published a bestseller in which he describes how the FBI asked him to look at the moon via remote viewing in the 1970s. What he saw there gave him the shivers. aliens who were doing some kind of work there and were obviously not very friendly towards humans. But what could the aliens want there? And are they really dangerous? A gigantic structure provides the answer. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been in the vicinity of the moon since 2009. NASA's probe found something enormous. In the shadowy regions near the poles, there was evidence of huge deposits of water ice. This discovery completely changes our view of the moon. For a long time, we thought the moon was boring, a completely dry celestial body, and that no life was possible there. But that's not true. There is water on the moon, at least enough to fill a small ocean. But the orbiter found even more. Signs of huge lava tunnels on the lunar surface show that the moon was once a geologically active world like ours. Not only are these tunnels unusual geological structures, scientists also admitted that they could provide potential sites for future human bases as they offer protection from extreme temperatures and radiation. Recordings of moonquakes revealed another phenomenon that should give us pause for thought. Several smaller impacts of meteorites left behind a strange phenomenon. The moon reverberated in such a peculiar way that scientists concluded that the moon could be almost hollow inside. If there are numerous caves on the moon that are suitable places to live, the moon is apparently quite hollowed out, and there is water on site. Other beings could have already come up with the idea of settling there, or at least maintaining a base. What the aliens find so interesting about the moon can now be explained quite simply. Mining on the moon? Isn't it fascinating that a mining expert has recognized traces of mining and even the outline of a mining vehicle on images of the moon? The evidence is almost overwhelming, and the rumors that there are aliens mining a resource on the moon can be traced back to the 1950s and 60s. But how did humans come up with this idea? It was either exceptionally gifted people like the clairvoyant Ingo Swann or whistleblowers from NASA or other institutions who leaked information. When remote viewer Ingo Swann saw aliens on the moon in the 1970s, he realized that they had been working in a crater. The mining activity fitted in very well with the behavior of the strange creatures. The fact that the FBI commissioned the clairvoyant to look at the moon shows that the National Security Agency and the US government already had knowledge of the alien life forms at that time. Since the Chinese have been exploring the far side of the moon with the Chang'e 5 rover, we also know what the aliens are looking for there. In a tiny sample of lunar rock, researchers from the Faculty of Science in Beijing found a very rare resource on Earth, helium-3. This raw material could solve our entire energy problem and save the Earth from climate collapse. The helium-3 isotope is ideal for nuclear fusion, which is a clean and highly effective way of generating electricity. The smallest amounts of fusion reactions also provide many times more energy than nuclear fission. What we have only recently learned may have been discovered by another species long before us. On Earth, we are also currently considering how helium-3 can be harnessed. A single space shuttle loaded with the raw material would be enough to supply the entire USA with electricity for a year. However, we are not yet technically equipped to send space shuttles to the moon and back at low cost. A single mission would cost billions, and you can already see that this would not be entirely sustainable, at least not at the moment. However, it will only be a matter of time before we are technologically capable of doing so. At the latest, if we don't manage to meet the Earth's ever-increasing energy needs with renewable energies, we will certainly come back to the incredible treasure that the moon is guarding. Are the aliens still on the moon? The unresolved questions of why aliens are so interested in the moon would most likely be answered. Questions remain as to who these beings are, where they come from, and whether they are still on the moon. There are many other indications that there are huge spaceships and underground entrances on the far side of the moon. Is that why China sent the very first rover to the far side of the moon to find out what is really going on there? Allegedly, Chang'e 5 is on an ordinary mission to take a closer look at the side of the moon that has only been explored very little so far. But we can't know that for sure. The information situation is confusing, and if we believe the many informants who claim that NASA and company are concealing their true knowledge about the moon, we have to assume that missions like this always have objectives that we are not informed about. Quite normal, or lights from spaceships? Light phenomena on the moon are called transient lunar phenomena by astronomers, and they have been around since humans have been looking at the moon with telescopes. One fascinating phenomenon on the moon are so-called light rays or ray cones that emanate from certain craters. These rays are bright lines that supposedly occur during meteorite impacts and are caused by swirling lunar material. These rays can be hundreds of kilometers long, and some critical voices claim that phenomena like these are not always of natural origin. The transient lunar phenomena occur with surprising regularity and are observed from Earth with various telescopes. Professor Dr. Ing Haken-Kyle from JMU Würzburg is a researcher who has worked intensively on the phenomena. In an interview with German television, the researcher said that we urgently need to clarify the origin of the phenomena before we send people to the moon again and have settlers live there for any length of time. Professor Kyle was certainly not explicitly referring to the existence of extraterrestrial technologies and presences on the moon, but the scientists' concerns show very well that we may know too little about the moon to be able to ensure the long-term safety of humans there. Are the lunar settlements just a fake? UFO researchers and critics of NASA long agreed that the world's largest space agency abruptly discontinued its moon missions because the threat posed by the presence of extraterrestrials had become too great. So it was all the more surprising when NASA presented the Artemis plans. Allegedly, NASA had plans for a manned space station on the moon in the drawer as early as the 1980s. But why have the plans been reactivated now, of all times, and how serious is NASA about them? Since 2017, NASA engineers have allegedly been working on new rockets and a spacecraft that could safely reach the moon. Since then, the project has been constantly postponed. Behind closed doors, some experts have claimed that NASA never really intended to return to the moon, and that Artemis was just a fake to distract from facts that were being concealed. The global public was all the more surprised when Artemis 1 was launched on November 16, 2022. The unmanned space capsule, named Orion, flew to the moon, orbited it once, and then returned. Artemis 2 is expected to fly to the moon for the first time with astronauts on board in May 2024. However, a landing is only planned for the crew of Artemis 3. It is not yet clear when this will take off. On August 23, 2023, the time had come. India proudly and jubilantly celebrated the landing of their first lunar rovers. The Chandrayaan-3 mission had succeeded after India suffered a crushing failure with Chandrayaan-2. The mission is ambitious. India wanted to be the first nation in the world to land rovers on the moon's south pole. Russia almost beat the Indians to the punch. Russian spaceflight also planned to explore the strategically important South Pole, but the landing of the Lunar 25 mission failed miserably just 3 days before India's triumph. The moon's South Pole is of immense importance for future lunar missions, which are also expected to land humans on the moon. Large deposits of water ice are hidden there. Water is to serve future human settlements on the moon as drinking and utility water. In addition, oxygen and even fuel can be produced from water. Large facilities could be built at the South Pole for this purpose, and a planned pipeline will pump water to more distant areas, settlements, or research stations on the moon. The southernmost reaches of the Earth satellite are by no means only advantageous. The area is known for challenging terrain. Uneven terrain, many craters, razor-sharp rocks, and very rare solar radiation make this an exceptional region. Russia's and India's lunar missions were planned as the first test run. Both missions were followed internationally with excitement. Can technical machines survive at the South Pole of the moon? There, where the terrain is impassable, and during the moon night, temperatures below -100 degrees prevail. The challenge of landing. Landings of probes and rovers are still engineering challenges. For the most part, other rovers landed on the moon or Mars in very safe areas, in large, flat craters, and wherever expensive vehicles and objects like them can be safely set down. Probes like Chandrayaan-3, but also the Chinese Chang'e probes, are objects costing millions of dollars. Losses are not only hard to bear for science, but also bitter financial setbacks for the nations concerned. The distance of hundreds of thousands or millions of kilometers to landers and rovers requires special radio technologies. Perseverance and Curiosity on Mars, for example, can be very well controlled from Earth. The Indian probes were a different story. The South Pole is so awkwardly located from Earth that radio signals arrive with a 1.4-second delay. That's not enough time to land the devices safely and without delay. So, Vikram was equipped with a fully automated landing system. Using cameras and sensors, the lander scanned the terrain as it approached the surface. Every bump and rock was registered. Vikram software was able to adjust the flight path to the conditions at any time, and so the spacecraft touched down gently on the lunar surface on August 23, 2023. Chandrayaan-1 to 3. Chandrayaan-3 is now to complete what the Indian Space Agency ISRO had been preparing for years. Chandrayaan-1 is an orbiter that has already been orbiting the moon for several years. Actually, Chandrayaan-2 should have landed on the moon as early as 2019, but the mission failed. The lander had difficulties during the descent, went off course, and a software error made the mission finally go wrong. The lander crashed and has been lost ever since. This year, India again launched nearly identical probes. Vikram and Pragyan were improved a bit and successfully reached the moon. After landing, Vikram released his little companion from its safekeeping inside the lander. Pragyan rolled down a ramp and did a few laps in the lunar dust. The pictures of the premiere went around the world and thrilled millions of people. Vikram's tasks are to measure temperatures at the South Pole, record vibrations, and conduct studies of the moon's almost non-existent atmosphere. The goals of the rover Pragyan, which weighs only 26 kilograms, are small reconnaissance missions. So far, however, Pragyan has not gone far. Only a little more than a week after landing did the lunar night fall, and Pragyan was put to sleep after covering 101 meters. On September 2, 2023, the 14-day lunar night dawned, and absolute darkness and freezing cold prevailed at the moon's south pole. The lander Vikram followed its small companion into sleep on September 4th, and 14 days later, both probes were to awaken again. Unfortunately, their hopes were not fulfilled. When the temperature at the landing site had risen above -10 degrees Celsius from September 22nd, the radio systems of the lander and rover should have activated automatically. But so far, ISRO experts listened for signals in vain. As of the publication date of this video, investigations are still ongoing. Although the Indian Space Agency has not officially confirmed the premature loss of the probes, it is highly likely that Vikram and Pragyan's technology could not withstand the more than -100-degree lunar night despite their best hopes. ISRO had decided not to equip either lander or rover with radionuclide heaters. On Mars rovers, such heating elements prevent the electronic components from dying of cold. It looks as if India will have to accept another setback. The mission of the two probes was supposed to last 5 months. India's space goals. India has been in the space business at least as long as the US or Russia. In the 1960s, Indians began launching their first satellites into space. The space program was started by a physicist, astronomer, and scientist named Vikram, who is now the namesake for India's first lunar rover. Of course, India hopes to strengthen its own position in the global space race, as well as gain economic and political advantages. It's remarkable what Indian scientists have pulled off on a budget that is tiny compared to the sums available to NASA. NASA was hoping for Indian success because the mission can provide valuable data for the upcoming Artemis missions, and India might have considered participating in the Mars settlement. Russia's Lunar 25 bust. Russia also wanted to shine by landing at the moon's south pole and studying ice deposits there. The ambitious Lunar 25 mission was planned as a triumph in the country's space history and ended in a dramatic fiasco. On August 20th, 2023, Russia launched its $150 million Lunar 25 spacecraft from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Just 3 days after launch, on August 23rd, technical difficulties arose during its descent to the moon. Communication systems showed anomalies and navigation instruments failed. The control center on Earth watched with bated breath as the probe hurtled uncontrollably toward the lunar surface. Despite the desperate attempts to stabilize the probe, the impact could not be avoided. The mission ended in a crater far from the planned landing site. The bust is similar to the failed Chandrayaan-2 mission and is also a major setback for Russian spaceflight. China's unusual moon discovery. While India and Russia mourn their failed missions, China celebrates one lunar success after another. The Chinese are not active at the South Pole, but they have sent a rover to a no less exotic area, the far side of the moon. There are numerous legends surrounding this place, and some believe that there has been mining activity on the far side of the moon for a long time, as well as a space station of extraterrestrial beings. Chang'e 5 has not found any aliens yet, but it has found something that may make further pole missions unnecessary. In a spectacular mission, the rover sent samples of moon rocks back to Earth, and Chinese scientists found enormous amounts of water in them. In fact, it turned out that the lunar soil is full of tiny glass beads with water trapped inside. If future settlers want to extract water on the moon, they probably won't have to build a pipeline to the South Pole at all. The water from the glass beads can be extracted anywhere on the moon only by heating the lunar rock. During the 36th lunar day, the Chinese Success rover made another fascinating discovery in the Kármán crater on the far side of the moon. The object was sighted from a distance of about 80 meters, roughly the length of a soccer field. Similarities to a hut led to numerous speculations about the nature of the object. Had Chang'e 5 finally found evidence of extraterrestrial activity on the moon? Experts rather suspect a large boulder, which visually only resembles a hut from a distance. The formation could be a remnant of a significant impact event. Currently, investigations of the object are ongoing, and Chang'e 5 will slowly approach the hut over the course of a 2 or 3 month journey. Mysterious rocket crash on the moon. On March 4, 2022, a rocket body collided with the lunar surface, initially resulting in a new double crater. This unusual crater was discovered by NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been orbiting the moon since 2009. The impact created 2 overlapping craters, an eastern crater 18 meters in diameter and a western crater 16 meters in diameter. Although astronomers had expected the impact after discovering that the rocket piece was on a collision course with the moon, the double crater was a surprise. The exact origin of the rocket body remains unclear. Initially, it was believed to be a stage of the SpaceX Falcon rocket that launched the U.S. Deep Space Climate Observatory in 2015. However, it was later corrected that it likely came from a Chinese lunar mission in 2014. Nevertheless, the Chinese Foreign Ministry denied that the booster came from its Chang'e 5 lunar mission. The confusion over the origin of the rocket stage has underscored the need to more closely monitor space debris in deep space surveillance. Meanwhile, on the moon, something else highly peculiar occurred as a result of the crash. After the impact, lunar seismometers recorded steady tremors. It is unusual for an impact to cause such intense vibrations that sound like a reverberating gong. The hollow moon theory. A very similar phenomenon appeared once before when astronauts on the Apollo 12 mission intentionally crashed their lunar module onto the lunar surface. Then too, the seismometers that had been placed on the moon since Apollo 11 registered long-lasting vibrations. Similar vibrations were also detected after the controlled crash of the 3rd stage of the Apollo 13 mission's Saturn V rocket onto the moon. The vibrations penetrated to a depth of more than 35 kilometers. This response from the moon indicates that it's not completely solid and led to speculation that large portions of the moon may be hollow. However, a hollow moon would not be a natural phenomenon and could indicate artificial intervention. In plain language, this would mean that there might be very large voids inside the moon after all, such as underground bases or even mining areas. A matter of time. The 6 manned lunar landing missions conducted under NASA's supervision remain among the most outstanding milestones in the history of the renowned space agency. Between 1969 and 1972, a total of 12 astronauts set foot on the dusty, crater-riddled surface of the Earth's moon. In the course of these space projects, which were as elaborate as they were effectively staged for the media, the participants collected various rock samples, carried out informative experiments, and last but not least, placed the flag of the United States on the surface of the moon. Since NASA is not a private company, but a U.S. federal agency financed by taxpayers' money, the size of the budget made available is always closely linked to the politically motivated goals of the government in office. If we go back to the era when preparations for the first manned moon landing in history were in full swing, we can quickly see why the US government was willing to subsidize its National Space Agency with generous financial injections at that time. After all,
As we know, the world was in the throes of the Cold War at the time. The political ideological dispute between the Western states and the nations of the Eastern Bloc was spreading to ever wider fields. In addition to waging proxy wars, such as in Vietnam, and countless covert intelligence operations, this also included attempts to outdo the hated adversary in every conceivable area. Ultimately, this profound conflict left our earthly home and spread to the galactic realms of the universe. In the so-called space race, however, the United States suffered some major defeats at first. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union became the first nation in history to send an artificial Earth satellite into orbit. A few months later, the dog Laika, on board Sputnik 2, became the first living creature ever to leave our blue home planet. The achievements of the enemy and internal failures led to the so-called Sputnik shock. Since then, the United States government has been more eager than ever to achieve even greater galactic milestones on its part in order to inflict an even more painful public ignominy on the adversary from the East. The first manned moon landing in 1969 marked the end of the space race for many historians. Since the Americans had now succeeded in putting the enemy in his place with their own achievements, the government could no longer justify to the population that it would continue to subsidize the corresponding moon landings over a longer period of time with the same immensely high tax money as before. In the aftermath of the galactic success, the public and political interest in countless further moon missions in the United States finally ebbed away more and more, so that the last moon landing to date was carried out just 3 years after the first. Hazardous radiation. Beside the fluctuating budgets NASA faces in the context of the changing governments and their different politically motivated goals, there are certain natural barriers to moon travel involving high health risks for astronauts. Among them is the influence of space radiation. As is well known, the moon, in contrast to our blue home planet, has only an extremely marginal atmosphere. Accordingly, the thin protective layer of the satellite is not capable of sufficiently filtering incoming radiation. The corresponding return flights are also associated with high radiation exposure for the space travelers involved. On average, a person on Earth is exposed to about 2 millisieverts of radiation per year. The average radiation levels recorded during the Apollo missions amounted to 0.5 millisieverts, and that after only a few days in space. For example, the astronauts who participated in the Apollo 14 mission in February 1971 absorbed as much radiation in just 9 days as a person on Earth would in about 6 years. Although the effects of this immense radiation exposure have not been established beyond doubt, most medical experts assume that it's associated with high health risks for the persons concerned. The cardiovascular system in particular is said to be affected by the prevailing radiation exposure, but permanent cell damage and cancer are also among the possible negative consequences of the extreme radiation levels. Since only very few Apollo astronauts were examined in the long term after their space missions, these potential consequential damages cannot be substantiated with large data sets. The incomparably high radiation exposure that the astronauts faced in space and on the lunar surface does not mean, however, that no human being will ever again set foot on the surface of the Earth satellite. On the contrary, experts are working at full speed to equip the space capsules and suits of astronauts with special, more effective radiation shields. These developments should ultimately enable astronauts to spend longer periods of time on the lunar surface without having to put up with damage to their health. Whether these measures will make long-lasting visits to the moon or even the establishment of a permanent moon station possible is still a matter of controversy among experts. The problem of moon dust. A further health danger not to be underestimated represents the natural condition of the moon. As most of you already know, the surface of the Earth's satellite is covered by a dense layer of dust. Those tiny particles, however, are very different from their terrestrial counterparts. Since neither winds nor rainfall exist on the moon, there is no natural factor there that could smooth the lunar dust particles. For this reason, the microscopic lunar dust particles have a razor-sharp structure. If a person inhales the particles in question, they can cause serious damage to the organism. Unfortunately, it's impossible to avoid the sharp dust particles becoming trapped in the astronauts' spacesuits and the equipment used during their work on the lunar surface. Consequently, the particles also enter the interior of the spacecraft in this way. In detail, the lunar dust particles are 50 times thinner than human hair. At the same time, they can settle in the astronauts' lungs for many months. Thus, it was that all 12 persons who have set a foot on the surface of the moon complained afterwards of so-called moon hay fever. The effects described ranged from sneezing attacks to blocked airways. Leading physicians are convinced that the inhalation of moon dust over a long period could lead to lung cancer. Brain cells could also be destroyed by the razor-sharp particles. Logistical effort. Another reason why leading space agencies have been reluctant to send a human being to the moon in recent decades is the effort involved. This refers not only to the costly development of a suitable spacecraft, but especially to the problems of supplying the participating astronauts. In detail, the natural satellite of the Earth is located approximately 1,000 times further away from our blue home planet than the International Space Station. In order for a human being to survive during a lunar mission, he or she will therefore need water and air purification systems, as well as equipment that can be used to generate electricity. Since our current resources don't allow us to regrow food in space, all the food that will be needed during the space program must also be carried from the beginning. Conversely, this also means that the duration and thus the potential success of an explorative mission is always limited by the capacity of the goods carried, which are essential for the survival of the astronauts. The construction of a permanent lunar station with galactic greenhouses could eliminate this problem in the future. It may take some time until this is a realistic possibility. The future of moon missions. Now that we have described some of the problems associated with a manned moon landing, one could quickly get the idea that another visit to the moon has been ruled out by the international space agencies. Fortunately, however, this is not the case. In fact, NASA is currently going full speed ahead to set humans on the surface of the Earth satellite within a few years' time. In spring 2019, the renowned space agency presented official plans for the so-called Artemis program. According to optimistic estimates, the project is to be implemented as early as 2024. Whether NASA will be able to meet its self-imposed schedule remains to be seen. However, the United States is not alone with its ambitious goals. Russia and China are also currently busy with preparations for the first lunar landing programs of their national history. The corresponding missions are to be launched in the 2030s. Now it's your turn. Did you already know about the problems that arise in the course of manned moon landings? And what do you think about the future mission plans of the different space agencies? We're already looking forward to your comments. Finally, please have a look at the other contributions of our channel, which you can now access by clicking on one of the images in the credits. Thanks for your interest, take care, and we'll see you next time.